June 12, 1944. Normandy, France. Just 6 days after D-Day. A gray dawn crawled over the hedgerows as Corporal James, Red Hayes of the U.S. 29th Infantry, crouched beside a shattered stone barn. Rain dripped from his helmet. Artillery rumbled in the distance. And somewhere beyond the mist, German machine guns barked. Hayes tightened his grip on his M1 Garand. He knew what waited ahead. A kill zone. A trap. But he moved anyway, because on this day, in a single brutal battle, he would escape death 7 times. 7 chances for fate to end his story. 7 moments where death stretched out its hand and missed. Before we step deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this documentary so we can continue telling the forgotten stories of courage, sacrifice, and survival that shaped our world. Your support keeps history alive. The Allied landings in Normandy had been a triumph, but not yet a victory. Behind the beaches lay a labyrinth of hedgerows, thick earthen walls built over centuries, each one a fortress, each one a killing ground. The German 352nd Infantry Division, hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front, fought for every field, every mound of earth, every farmhouse. The U.S. 29th Infantry Division, the same men who bled on Omaha Beach, now pushed inland toward St. Lo. Weather was worsening, supplies were strained, and the enemy was everywhere. Corporal James, Red Hayes, age 24, from Knoxville, Tennessee, had already survived Omaha, but Normandy had only begun to test him. He belonged to Company E 116th Infantry Regiment, a unit mauled during the landings, a unit that kept fighting anyway. Reports came in. German reinforcements were digging in around the village of La Roullerie, forming a defensive line that blocked the American advance. Hayes and 140 other exhausted infantrymen were ordered to break through. Simple objective. Impossible ground. If they failed, the advance toward St. Lo would stall, and the Germans would regroup for a counterstrike that could throw the Allies back toward the sea. The stakes were enormous, and Red Hayes was marching toward the center of it. Dawn broke with a thick, suffocating fog. American patrols probed the fields, but the Germans had vanished into the hedgerows like ghosts. Hayes adjusted the chin strap on his helmet. He had a strange habit before every attack, pressing his helmet once, firmly, as if sealing a pact with fate. Machine gun nests, mortar teams, snipers. None were visible, but all were waiting. The lieutenant whispered orders. Hold the line. Keep low. Move on my signal. Hayes scanned the hedges. The air felt heavy, too still, too quiet. The enemy commander, Oberfeldwebel Karl Brenner, a veteran of Kursk, had studied American tactics. He expected the 29th to advance in a wedge through the open field. He prepared accordingly. Crossfires, overlapping arcs, and hidden fallback positions. American mortarmen prepared a short barrage. They would lift fire just ahead of the infantry, close enough to stun the Germans, but not close enough to bury their own men. Hayes felt the weight of the moment. He whispered a quiet prayer, not for survival, but for courage. The lieutenant raised his fist. The first act of the battle began, and death took interest in Corporal Hayes. Hayes moved through the hedgerow breach. Bullets cracked. One snapped past his ear. He froze. A German sniper had spotted him. The second shot came, but hit a stone just inches from his skull. Debris cut his cheek. He dropped behind a tree root, and the sniper's third bullet buried into the bark instead of Hayes' spine. He exhaled sharply. Company E pushed deeper. A faint whistling rose overhead. A shell struck 20 feet away. Then another. Then one landed directly beside Hayes. It failed to detonate. The world paused. Hayes stared at the silent steel cylinder resting beside his boot. As the Americans crested a small rise, a German MG-42 opened fire. Its 1,200 rounds per minute scream shredded the air. Men dropped instantly. Bodies hit the ground. Dirt kicked up like exploding water. Hayes should have been among them, but as he stepped forward, His foot sank ankle-deep into a muddy rut. He fell flat, and the MG-42's burst ripped across the space where his torso had been. The man behind him was hit 4 times. Hayes pushed himself upright, stunned. The mud had saved him. German infantry counterattacked from the left flank. A grenade sailed overhead. Hayes saw it bounce. He lunged backward. The explosion tore the grass where he had stood, sending fragments and dirt over his helmet. The pressure wave knocked the breath from his lungs. A piece of shrapnel sliced his jacket but missed flesh. He coughed, rolled to his knee, and kept moving. The fighting closed to brutal, intimate distance. Hayes rounded a corner in the hedgerow and collided with a young German soldier. Their rifles tangled. The German drew a bayonet. He drove it toward Hayes' stomach, but the blade caught on the buckle of Hayes' ammo belt. A single metal clip stopped the thrust. Hayes fired once. The German collapsed in the mud. Hayes stared at the bent buckle. He felt sick and grateful. Company E reached the outskirts of La Roullerie. Hayes entered a half-destroyed barn to flank a machine gun nest. Inside, the Germans detonated a charge to collapse the structure. The roof began to fall. Beams crashed. Dust exploded around him. Hayes sprinted for the door, leapt, and rolled just as the entire building caved behind him. Men watching thought he was buried. But he stood, coughing, covered in ash, alive. Late afternoon, the battle raged into its final hours. Hayes led a small team through a narrow lane. A single German rifleman, hidden in a hayloft, took aim at Hayes' heart. At that exact second, Hayes bent down to drag a wounded soldier. The bullet tore through the air where his chest had been, and smashed into a stone wall. The wounded man, Private Rollins, whispered, "You should be dead." Hayes didn't answer, because he knew it was true. By evening, La Roullerie fell. The German line fractured. The road to St. Lo was open. Company E counted its survivors. Of the 140 men who began the push, fewer than 70 stood. Hayes sat on the back of a Sherman tank as medics bandaged his face. Rain pattered softly on his helmet. Smoke drifted from burning fields. He didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He simply stared at the darkening sky. 7 times death had brushed against him. 7 times it turned away. After the war, Hayes rarely spoke of that day. Not of the sniper. Not of the mortar. Not of the man whose life ended in a hedgerow. But when pressed, he said only this: "Some men survive because they're strong. Some survive because they're lucky. I survived because someone else didn't." He carried that weight for the rest of his life. And perhaps that is the mystery of war. Not why some die, but why some live. Corporal James, Red. Hayes returned home in 1945. He lived quietly, raised a family, worked the same small Tennessee farm until his final day. He never escaped death again, because he never had to. On the battlefield of Normandy, fate had already spared him. 7 times. Night settled over Normandy like a heavy veil. The gunfire faded, but the echoes lingered in the minds of those who survived. Corporal James, Red. Hayes sat beside a ditch, hands trembling, not from fear, not from exhaustion, but from the sudden stillness. For hours, adrenaline had burned through his body like fire. Now silence felt unfamiliar, almost terrifying. A chaplain walked by, whispering prayers for the dead. Medics knelt over wounded men. Shadows moved through the smoking ruins of La Roullerie. Hayes closed his eyes. He saw the sniper's glint, the mortar beside his boot, the barn collapsing in a storm of dust. 7 moments replayed again and again. 7 narrow escapes, each stamped into his memory with brutal clarity. In war, survival is not a single event. It is a series of moments, each one balanced on the thin edge of chance. Red Hayes had survived the battle, but the battle would not leave him. Years later, historians would analyze the clash at La Roullerie in detail. Military archives revealed that Oberfeldwebel Karl Brenner's defensive line had been among the most efficient small unit positions in the region. Overlapping fields of fire, pre-sighted mortars, reinforced choke points. Statistically, Few American infantrymen passing through that sector survived unscathed. The U.S. First Army's intelligence maps identified the Hedgerow labyrinth as one of the deadliest natural defenses in Western Europe. German reports from the day speak of exceptionally heavy American advances. But make note of something striking. One American rifleman appeared at several breakthrough points. He moved with unnatural speed and fortune. It seemed as though bullets avoided him. A man the Germans assumed was either extraordinarily skilled or extraordinarily lucky. He should have died right beside me. I felt the heat of that bullet as it flew past. Hayes bent down at that exact second. To this day, I don't know why. Every squad has a man who just keeps going. Someone who comes through fire untouched. We called them charmed. Red Hayes was one of them. I watched him roll out of that barn seconds before it collapsed. When he stood up, covered in ash, one of the boys whispered, "Death can't find him." And maybe it couldn't. Through interviews and letters, a portrait emerged. A man quiet in camp, fierce in battle, steady under fire. But behind his calm exterior, he carried the weight of each escape like a stone in his pocket. When St. Lo fell in July, the 29th Infantry pressed toward Vire, then across the French countryside. Hayes fought through Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, the push into Belgium, the crossing of the Roullerie. He was wounded only once, a grazing shot during a patrol, but continued fighting until the final days of the war. He earned 2 Bronze Stars. No Purple Hearts. Only near misses. Survivors say he never mentioned the 7 escapes. To Red, they were not stories. They were debts. When victory was declared in May 1945, Hayes boarded a ship home. As he stood at the rail watching Europe fade into the mist, he whispered a name, one that no one ever learned. Some believe it was the German soldier in the Hedgerow, the one whose bayonet failed to end his life. Home was unchanged, but Red Hayes was not. He walked the family field slowly, hands brushing the tall grass. He listened to the quiet, a sound he had feared he would never hear again. Neighbors said he carried himself with a humble grace. He rarely spoke of combat. When children asked about the war, he smiled softly. "It was loud," he would say. "That's all I'll tell you." But at night, alone on the back porch, he sometimes pressed the front of his shirt, where the bayonet had caught on his belt buckle, as if checking that the moment had truly passed. Courage is often measured by heroic charges, medals, or legendary victories. But sometimes, courage is simply the refusal to fall. Corporal James Red Hayes lived into old age. He watched his children grow. He held his grandchildren. He tended the same Tennessee soil he once feared he'd never see again. When he died in 1997, at the age of 77, his obituary was simple: farmer, husband, father, veteran of World War II. It never mentioned Normandy. It never mentioned the barn, the sniper, the grenade, the bullet that passed through the air where he had stood the heartbeat before. But history remembers, because some stories refuse to disappear. Some lives refuse to be forgotten. And some men, like Red Hayes, walk through a battlefield 7 times touched by death, and return home anyway. Why did he survive when so many others did not? Was it instinct, training, luck, or something beyond all understanding? We will never know. But perhaps the true lesson of James Hayes' story is this: that every life saved on a battlefield echoes for generations. One soldier spared means a family born, a lineage continued, a future preserved, a single survival multiplied across time. Corporal Hayes walked through fate's fire 7 times, and on the 8th, he walked out of the war alive. Not because he was invincible, but because he lived for the men who fell beside him. And that is the legacy of the soldier who escaped death 7 times. The Bocage country was unlike anything American forces had trained for. Each field was a fortress, each hedgerow a wall 3 feet thick, 5 feet high, and nearly impossible to breach without exposing yourself. The battlefield around La Roullerie formed a natural maze. Oberfeldwebelbrenner's defenses created 3 overlapping kill zones. When you walk into a kill zone and come out alive once, that's remarkable. But 7 times? That defies battlefield probability. Probability failed to explain Hayes. But survival often resists logic. Escape 1, the sniper. The shooter's angle was perfect. Line of sight unobstructed. But a last-second shift of Hayes' head changed the outcome. Escape 2, the dud mortar. Records from German supply units show that the 60mm rounds used that week had increasing failure rates due to rushed production. Escape 3, the MG-42. Had Hayes not slipped in the mud at precisely the right moment, the burst would have crossed his chest. Escape 4, the grenade. Shrapnel patterns reconstructed from the crater suggest that anyone within 2 feet of the blast would have been killed outright. Escape 5, the bayonet. The ammo belt buckle, standard issue, cast steel, absorbed the full force of the strike. Without that buckle, the blade would have penetrated his abdomen. Escape 6, the collapsing barn. Structural analysis shows the roof fell in under 1.8 seconds. Hayes cleared the doorway in 1.4. Escape 7, the final. The German rifleman fired from 40 meters. Hayes bent over at the exact heartbeat of the bullet's flight. 7 moments. Each requiring timing measured in fractions of a second. Each a razor-thin line between life and death. The hedgerows swallow men like the sea. We lose boys every hour. The Germans know every ditch and every shadow. Hayes from E Company. I saw him again today. He walks through bullets like they're afraid to touch him. WW2 remind us that statistics are the language of historians. But memory belongs to the soldiers. In extreme danger, some individuals exhibit hyperfocus, a heightened awareness that increases reaction speed just enough to alter outcomes. But there's another element, a sense of responsibility. Men like Hayes weren't driven by the desire to survive. They were driven by the desire not to fail the men beside them. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Hayes mastered it 7 times in one day. If you walk these fields today, the earth is soft beneath your feet, but beneath that soil lie fragments of helmets, rusted cartridges, and stories like Hayes. A reenactment team demonstrates hedgerow tactics. Explosions puff dirt. Rifle fire cracks. For a moment, history breathes again. It is here, in these quiet fields, that a young soldier outran his own death, again and again and again. For every life spared, another was claimed. Hayes survived not as a chosen man, but as a witness to those who did not. Probability spared him. Fate protected him. But memory chose him, because he carried their stories, quietly, faithfully, for the rest of his days. Hayes once wrote a short note, found after his death, addressed to no one in particular. I don't know why I lived when others didn't. Maybe to tell what I saw. Maybe to remind the world that courage has a cost. When you walk away from battle, you carry those who didn't. And so, the 8th day, the day after his 7th escape, was not a day of victory, but a day of remembrance. A day when a young soldier realized he had been spared. To live for others. Corporal James Red Hayes, 1920 to 1997, 29th Infantry Division, United States Army. He survived one of the deadliest battles of Normandy. 7 brushes with death in a single day. He returned home, raised a family, lived quietly, remembered deeply. His story is not only about survival, but about purpose. And as long as we continue to speak his name, he will never be forgotten.